So I may have been gone for quite a while, but I've still been reading a lot. If you're new here, I'm Stephanie, a lover of all things stories, and welcome to Literati Medium. It's been a while since my last wrap up, and what can I say? Life got busy, real life responsibilities piled up, and unfortunately that meant the channel had to take a little bit of a backseat. Even though I wasn't uploading, I was still reading and maybe coping with current circumstances by tearing through my TBR. Since my last wrap up, which was in February, I've read 49 books. And there were some that have really stuck with me. So I'm going to share my favorite books from each of the months that I didn't do a wrap up on, and then I'll also do a full July wrap up in this video. And just a quick heads up, I have been working to try and get a bit of a video backlog so that hopefully we won't have super long lags like this in the future. But unfortunately, life sometimes happens, and while I'm going to try and post consistently, I can't guarantee that that will always happen. Please know that even when I'm posting, I really miss talking to all of you, and that I am really excited to talk about books. So the first book that I'm going to mention is my favorite book that I read in March. It's actually the second book in a trilogy, and that is The Gilded Cage by Lynette Noni. This is the second book in the Prison Healer series, so I'm going to give you a quick summary of book 1 right now. 17-year-old prison healer Kiva Meriden enters into a trial in place of the rebel queen, and she'll risk her chance of life, freedom, and a chance to find love in order to find truth in a prison where no one ever survives. So I read the first book in the series for my work book club, and this is the first series in a while where I read the first book and then immediately felt like I needed to read the second book. The Gilded Cage is actually a really satisfying midpoint to a trilogy, and that's really unusual for me. I typically find the midpoint of a series kind of unbearably dark, and oftentimes I find that the pacing is really uneven because it is like the midpoint of the series as a whole. So it tends to just drag on a bit. That is not the case with The Gilded Cage. What I really liked about the second book is, while the first book is like this trial by ordeal, the second book really strengthens the emotional connections you feel to the characters. And there's a great theme of found family versus birth family, and that really added nuance to the relationships. The shift in setting between book 1 and book 2 was really satisfying, and I don't want to give anything away, but I really enjoyed getting to see a different part of this world. And this installment is a bit more introspective, although there is still plenty of plot. My only real critique of this book is that some of the plot points feel predictable, but they're predictable in a satisfying way. Next up is my favorite read from April. And this is a book that honestly I never would have picked up on my own, but it really struck me with how emotionally layered it was when I was reading it. And it's also one of the most cinematic sci-fi books that I've read in a really long time. And that is Sea of Rust by Robert C. Cargill. This is set in a post-apocalyptic world where AI has destroyed humanity. And the great mind AIs are kind of battling sovereignty in the new world order. And anyone that doesn't join a hive mind ends up having to scavenge for parts in order to stay alive. And that's our hero, Brittle. This was my online book club's pick for April, and I honestly knew nothing about it going into reading this. And I can honestly say I wasn't expecting the emotional gut punch that I was about to receive, especially in light of how much our society is changing due to AI right now. Sea of Rust isn't what I would call an enjoyable read in the traditional sense of the word, but it was really thought-provoking in a way that stayed with me long after I finished it. The characters are all really fascinating because they all kind of reflect a different facet of survival and loss. While the whole cast was really interesting, there were really only 2 characters that I felt any kind of emotional tie to. What surprised me most about this book was how beautifully written it is. It's a deeply philosophical story about memory, identity, and the cost of survival. This is a story about what it means to survive, and honestly, more importantly, what is worth dying for. Now let's move into May, and this is a pick that honestly really surprised me when I read it. I could not have asked for more from a dark romantasy, and that is Death's Kiss by M.M. Reeves. Captain Marina Boreas must fight for her future, and honestly her past. It's set in a world where there are deadly trials and rival pirate orders. But underneath all of this, there's something buried in her that needs to be discovered. I've been in the book content space for about 4 years now, and one of my favorite book talkers is Rachel Skye Reads. So naturally, when she created the Nerd Fam, I joined in the hopes of maybe getting approved for a fun romantasy book art. But I was also a bit nervous because I didn't know what to expect other than pirates. And as May is pretty much the beginning of summer here in North Carolina, my cabin fever was strong. So pirates sounded like a great idea. Death's Kiss pulled me in right at the start with a really clever introduction to the main character. I had never read an intro like this before. And the world that M.M. Reeves creates, it somehow really gets that vintage pirate feel, but also includes fantasy futuristic tech. And it's all kind of wrapped up into this haunting atmosphere that gave me Gideon the Ninth vibes. The characters are layered and complex, and I really appreciated how the different relationships evolved throughout the book. There's a really strong undercurrent of found family and self-discovery in this novel, and it really grounds the story emotionally. For me, one of the highlights was the female friendships. They were supportive, sharp, and full of heart. The plot has Hunger Games but make it pirates energy. And yes, enemies to lovers is very much a present trope in this book. And it's hot. It's complicated. And they have absolutely the worst timing. Which, of course, makes it even better. This really became a standout read for me this year. It's not going to be for everyone, but if you enjoy romantasy, you're probably going to like this book. And I'm incredibly grateful to the Nerd family and M.M. Reeves for giving me this opportunity. I'm so sorry this review is so late. And before we get into my July wrap-up, my favorite book from June is a bit of a quieter book than the other books on this list so far. But it really hit me in such a personal way that I'm still thinking about it weeks later. The Wedding People by Alison Espach. Phoebe arrives at a luxury inn for what she thinks is going to be a great escape, only to be swept up into someone else's wedding plans and find a connection that she really wasn't expecting. So this was the June book for my roommate's book club, and I have to say, it really pleasantly surprised me. But I also read it during a particularly difficult time for myself, mental health-wise, and it has very similar vibes to The Midnight Library. If you know, you know. It was really a quiet book that caught me off guard. Not because it did something wildly unexpected, but because it really did something that felt true. The characters feel really formed in a way that you might not always agree with, but always feels true. They're complex, sometimes frustrating, not always super realistic, but very complex. The almost dreamlike setting works perfectly for this story because it feels removed from reality. Espach's writing is really beautiful without being super showy, and the plot delivers emotional gut punches when you least expect it. But it always pulls back just enough with dark humor to keep the story from being unbearably dark. Underneath it all, this is a book that's about grief. But it's also about doing the hard, messy, and uncomfortable things in order to be truly happy. And that theme snuck up on me in a way that felt honest and just a little bit painful, but in a good way. Alright, now that I've kind of gone over my standout reads from March through June, let's dive into what I read in July. Of course, I'm always going to start with my least favorite and work my way up to my favorite book of the month, so make sure you stick around to the end. And we're starting off with my least favorite book of the month, which is a book that I really wanted to love, especially after being so invested after reading 2 installments. Unfortunately, this one left me feeling more frustrated than fulfilled. The Atlas Complex by Olivie Blake. This, of course, is the 3rd book in the Atlas 6 trilogy by Olivie Blake. To avoid spoilers, here's a summary of book 1. So each decade, 6 scholars get accepted into the Alexandrian society. But of those 6 initiates, only 5 can actually be initiated. And the price for failure is death. So I read this to fulfill a magical readathon prompt. My character, Osmanthus, in the magical readathon is currently doing her August 2024 term. And I chose this book in order to get the qualified grade in alchemy, which is one of the classes she has to take for her herbalist profession. The prompt was to read a book that was traditionally published after being indie published. And while this book I don't believe was ever independently published, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, the first book in this series was, so I'm saying it counts. This was, for me, a really frustrating end to the series. I had really hoped that it would pay off, and it just didn't. By the time I got to the final chapters, I just realized, kind of bitterly, that I genuinely disliked everything about this series. And I particularly did not like the characters that made it all the way to the end. And it wasn't like in the fun, they're morally gray way. It was just like, I don't care what happens to any of these people. The world building, especially around the Alexandrian society, always feels a bit foggy to me. And while the prose wanted to feel sharp and intellectual, they often came off as overcomplicated. Like the prose are trying too hard to make the characters sound smarter than the story actually allows them to be. And that imbalance really made it difficult to stay emotionally invested, especially when the actual plot momentum kept kind of stalling out. I think I've just finally accepted that Olivie Blake is not an author for me. The thematic through line about ambition, success, and what we're willing to trade for that success might be classic dark academia, but here it left me feeling hollow, and it's definitely just not themes that kind of align with my personal core values. And maybe that feeling hollow because of the pursuit of ambition is the point, but I'm still kind of mad that I had to read 3 books to get there. Needless to say, I will be unhauling my Illumicrate editions of all 3 books, which is sad because they are so beautiful. But this is where I do a shameless self-plug of my Pango shop. So if you are interested in any of the books that I have listed, you can find them on my Pango shop, and 75% of all proceeds that go to my Pango shop get donated to Save the Children. So make sure to check out the link in the description box below. I'm not even mildly curious about Gifted and Talented, which was one of my Owl Crate adult fantasy books that I received, so I'm actually unhauling that one too. Next up is a book that I was really hoping to love, especially given the premise and the author. And while there were elements that I enjoyed, it ended up just not landing in the way that I wanted it to. Warm Hands of Ghosts by Katherine Arden. In the final months of World War I, a wounded nurse and her missing brother are drawn into a haunting mystery where grief, memory, and the supernatural kind of blur. And each must confront whether it's better to hold on to the world they knew or let it go altogether. This was actually my August book club pick for my sister's book club, so I'm actually a month ahead in this book club. Why? I think I got confused and thought we were a month behind. So, oops. The Warm Hands of Ghosts is one of those books that I wanted to love more than I actually did. The characters were likable and grounded, especially the brother, who was probably the emotional core of the story to me. I also enjoyed the subtle romance between our main character and the doctor, as well as the unlikely bond between the brother and a German soldier. Those relationships all felt real, layered, and earned. The plot had a lot of narrative potential, and there were moments that really pulled me in. The book also explores some compelling themes like grief, moral courage, the trauma of war, and the ways in which people try to hold on to humanity in the face of horror. But here's where the story lost me. I'm just not sure it needed a fantasy element at all. The World War I setting was so well done, and because of that, when the supernatural stuff actually came in, it felt really jarringly out of place. And I think the story just might have hit harder without it. And while I was reading it, I never felt particularly excited to return to it when I was reading it. I'd put on the audiobook and just feel kind of meh. Not bored, not frustrated, just emotionally detached. In the end, I think this was a case of the right book, wrong reader. The themes and emotional arcs are there, but the tone and execution just didn't click for me in the way that I wanted it to. Next up is a story that hits hard, and reading it for the first time right now brought a whole new layer to the experience. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Offred serves as a handmaid in the dystopian Republic of Gilead. She is valued only for her fertility in a society that has stripped women of all of their rights. Hey, you get a sneak peek right here on my next book versus adaptation. Honestly, if this wasn't my book versus adaptation, I don't know if I would have read it at all, especially not right now, because it's a lot, which of course you'll find out more about that in a few weeks when I post my book versus adaptation video. Handmaid's Tale is one of those books that feels both timeless and terrifyingly timely. The characters are compelling, but there's a deliberate distance to them, partially because the story is filtered so deeply through Offred's perspective. And Offred tells us straight up several times that she might not be the most reliable narrator. And that sense of remove really adds to the eerie, unsettling atmosphere. What stood out to me is how vividly the novel portrays religious fascism. Sometimes it's exaggeratedly dystopian, and sometimes it's in a way that feels really scarily plausible. The world that Atwood builds is so horrifying, precisely because of how grounded it is into real systems of oppression, especially around gender, language, and reproduction. The prose are quietly devastating and very beautiful. That said, the plot can feel disjointed at times, especially if you go in expecting a clear narrative arc. But at the end, or at least in the version that I read, I don't know that if this is in most of the books, but the story kind of gets restructured through a lens that makes that disjointed feeling make sense. The gaps and inconsistencies that I noticed kind of come full circle with that explanation. And it's the kind of payoff that really makes you want to go back and reread it to see if you pick up on it or see it in a new way with that revelation included in. At its core, this is a book about power, how it's taken, how it's enforced, and how people respond to it, whether by resisting, surviving, or complying. It's chilling, brilliant, and really far too relevant in the world today. Next up, we have Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. This is book 2 in the Binti novella trilogy, and to prevent spoilers, here's a summary of book 1. Binti is the first of the Himba people to get accepted into a prestigious intergalactic university. But in order to go, she has to abandon everything that she knows and travel across the galaxy. And on her journey, ancient conflicts, cultural tension, and her own identity collide in unexpected and life-altering ways. So reading the Binti trilogy was the book that I was supposed to read for my sister's book club in July. And the reason the first novella is not on this list is because I read it in June and not July. Nnedi Okorafor is a wonderful writer. Her writing is filled with really vivid imagery and strong characters. And she has really rich world building, which she expands far beyond the scope of the first book in the second installment. It explores cultural identity and belonging, and the plot takes some really intriguing turns. That said, the experience of reading it felt a little disjointed. I really appreciated how the world opened up, but the tone and direction of the second installment felt very different from the first installment in this trilogy. It left me feeling like I wasn't really reading the same story that was in the first novella. But there's still a lot to admire here, and I was excited to read the third installment, which is the book that is in my number 3 spot for the books that I read in July. Binti, The Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor. So naturally, after finishing Home, I had to finish the third book. It really brings the trilogy to a powerful, if slightly uneven, conclusion. I really loved the romance that was kind of woven into this final installment. It added some emotional depth and grounded the story in a way that worked really well for me. And this third book also managed to kind of even out some of the tonal and plot shifts between book 1 and book 2 that I just mentioned. And it made the overall arc feel more cohesive. That said, I do have some mixed feelings about the ending. Without getting into spoilers, there's a moment towards the end that feels like it's jumping the shark a little bit. And it makes the resolution feel a bit overpowered compared to the story that happens before it. But what I really appreciated about this novella trilogy were the themes. The book leans really hard into questions about transformation, what it means to adjust to new truths, and what it actually means to be human or to belong when your identity is constantly shifting. It's an ambitious and thoughtful story, even if it didn't fully land for me. And coming up as my runner-up in July is a kind of light romantic read that had some fun moments. That was Plot Twist by Erin Rosa. When a romance writer who has no real-life love experience goes viral, she goes on a quest to reconnect with her exes to see why she never fell in love with them. And she may be falling for her reclusive ex-actor star landlord while she goes on this adventure. So this was actually my pick for my workbook club this month. I bought it when I went to my friend's wedding in California back in May because I went to Vroman's, which is an indie bookstore there, and I told myself that I wasn't going to buy anything that I could buy somewhere else. So when I saw that this was actually a signed copy, I was like, oh, well, this is something that I can't get anywhere else, and it sounds kind of fun. And this was a really kind of pleasant read. The leads are especially likable, and a lot of the side characters are pretty likable too, although I definitely had strong feelings about Poppy and Poppy's mother in this story. And while Poppy does come around by the end, it took me a while to warm up to her. I really appreciated how grounded this book felt in its setting. The tone and atmosphere really captured the feel of LA. Lots of underlying image management mixed with creative energy. The writing is witty and the dialogue is snappy, and that made for a pretty pleasant read. Plot-wise, it was fine. Nothing groundbreaking, but it worked for the story being told. That being said, the pacing of the central relationship felt a little off for me. Some moments felt really rushed while others dragged, and that made the emotional payoff a little less satisfying than it could have been. You know, I'm a theme girly, and what really stood out to me about this book were the themes. It deals with addiction, forgiveness, and self-acceptance, and it handles all of those themes with care. This is a book that's not going to be a new favorite, but I am glad that I picked it up. If you made it this far, drop a star emoji in the description box below to let me know that you're still watching. And now it's time to reveal my favorite read from July, and that was We Came to Welcome You by Vicent Tirado. Now you may know that this was on my August TBR, but I have managed to finish it between my TBR and the recording of this video. So in the exclusive gated community of Mainless Grove, Sol Reyes begins to unravel. She's haunted by strange occurrences, a suspiciously perfect neighborhood, and a creeping fear that conformity isn't just expected, it might be a matter of life or death. This was my roommate's book club pick for July, and I was excited to get to read some horror. I didn't know anything about this book, but I can say on the horror front that it's been a while since I wasn't able to fall asleep to a horror novel. There are some truly creepy moments in this one. This is not a story where the characters are likable, but they are very real. Sol Reyes and her wife Alice are both deeply flawed, messy individuals. The horror here comes from conformity, especially for a person whose very existence falls outside the norms, like Sol Reyes. As a Black and Latina woman, she is constantly being forced to tone herself down, to assimilate into a community that only sees her value when she's been scrubbed of everything that she is. Her wife, Alice, who is Korean, is more readily accepted at first, which adds another layer to the book's exploration of race, respectability, and survival. The neighbors are exactly the right kind of unsettling, too friendly vanilla you hope you never have to live next to. But the HOA functions as a brilliant metaphor for forced assimilation. Mainless Groves has all the polished pastel charm of Stepford, but the threat lying underneath it is far more otherworldly and terrifying. The plot does take its time to build tension. Maybe a little more than necessary, but I would say the payoff is worth it. The dread creeps in slowly, layer by layer, and when the horror finally arrives, it hits hard. The ending is satisfyingly bleak in a way that only really good horror can provide. It's an ending that makes you think about what it really means to survive. If you want to join me on my reading journey for the rest of this month, make sure to check out my August TBR video. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.